John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb outside Boston. He was the second child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a businessman with political ambitions, and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, who came from a well-known Boston family. Kennedy's grandparents on both sides were children of Irish immigrants. His paternal grandfather, P.J. Kennedy, had worked as an East Boston ward boss and served in the Massachusetts state legislature. His maternal grandfather, John F. Fitzgerald, served in Congress and completed 2 terms as mayor of Boston. Kennedy grew up in a large household with 8 siblings. His older brother was Joseph Jr., followed by 7 younger siblings: Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Ted. The family enjoyed financial security, as Joseph Kennedy Sr. had accumulated a substantial fortune and established trust funds for each of his children. Kennedy's early years were shaped by regular exposure to political conversation at home. His father encouraged ambition, strict academic performance, and constant discussion of public affairs. Kennedy's first direct experience with politics occurred in 1922, when he accompanied his maternal grandfather through Boston neighborhoods during a gubernatorial campaign. In 1927, the family moved from Massachusetts to the Riverdale area of New York City. This relocation was partly due to concerns about a polio outbreak in Massachusetts and partly related to Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s business activities in New York and Hollywood. The family continued to spend summers and early autumns in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and winter holidays in Palm Beach, Florida, where they maintained additional homes. Kennedy's schooling began at the Canterbury School in Connecticut, where he enrolled for 8th grade in 1930. A medical issue led to an appendectomy in 1931, after which he left the school to recover at home. Later that year, he entered Choate, a preparatory boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut. His mother had hoped her sons would attend a Catholic institution, but his father believed that a non-Catholic, elite school would better prepare them for public life. At Choate, Kennedy was known for average academic performance and occasional pranks. One notable incident involved his group setting off a firecracker under a toilet seat. The headmaster referred to the pranksters as muckers, a term that Kennedy later adopted to name his small social group, the Muckers Club. Kennedy graduated from Choate in 1935, ranking 64th out of 112 students. He served as business manager of the school yearbook and was voted most likely to succeed. After graduation, Kennedy planned to study under Harold Laski at the London School of Economics, but poor health forced him to return to the United States. He briefly enrolled at Princeton University in 1935, but withdrew after 2 months due to illness. In 1936, Kennedy entered Harvard College. He wrote occasionally for the Harvard Crimson, but focused primarily on athletics and his social life. He played on the junior varsity football team until an injury ended his participation and contributed to lasting back problems. He joined the Hasty Pudding Club and the Spee Club, one of Harvard's selective final clubs. In 1938, Kennedy traveled to London with his older brother to work at the American Embassy, where their father was serving as U.S. ambassador. The next year, Kennedy traveled through several regions of Europe, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East as part of his research for a senior thesis. He visited Berlin shortly before the outbreak of World War II and carried diplomatic information back to his father. Kennedy returned to London on September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. He assisted with arrangements for surviving American passengers from the torpedoed SS Athenia before returning to the United States on his first transatlantic flight. During his later years at Harvard, Kennedy showed more interest in his studies and earned a place on the dean's list. In 1940, he completed his thesis on the British approach to the Munich Agreement, titled Appeasement in Munich. It was later published as Why England Slept, which became a bestseller. The book examined Britain's military unpreparedness and argued for closer cooperation between Britain and the United States. Kennedy expressed increasing support for American involvement in the war, views that contrasted sharply with his father's isolationist position. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1940 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in government, focusing on international affairs. He briefly attended the Stanford Graduate School of Business, auditing classes, before leaving to assist his father with his memoirs. In early 1941, Kennedy traveled through South America, completing his final major trip before entering military service. Kennedy originally planned to attend Yale Law School after completing his undergraduate studies, but he abandoned this plan as the likelihood of American involvement in World War II increased. In 1940, he attempted to enter the Army Officer Candidate School. Although he trained for several months, he was medically disqualified because of ongoing back issues. With assistance from Alan Goodrich Kirk, the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence and a former colleague of his father, Kennedy was able to join the United States Naval Reserve on September 24, 1941. He received his commission as an ensign on October 26 and was assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. In January 1942, Kennedy was transferred to the Oney Field Office at the 6th Naval District Headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. Despite wanting to command a patrol torpedo, PT boat, his medical condition made active duty unlikely. His father intervened by providing selective medical information and promoting the idea that Kennedy's service would bring positive attention to the PT fleet. Kennedy completed 6 months of training at the Naval Reserve Officer Training School in Chicago and at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. His first command was PT-101, which he held from December 7, 1942, until February 23, 1943. Dissatisfied with an assignment in the Panama Canal Zone, he contacted Senator David Walsh of Massachusetts. Walsh arranged for Kennedy to be reassigned to the South Pacific, where combat conditions were more active. In April 1943, Kennedy was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 2. On April 24th, he assumed command of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat stationed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Late on the night of August 2, 1943, PT-109 was part of a group of 15 PT boats sent to block a Japanese convoy transporting food, supplies, and troops to Kolombangara. American commanders had received advance intelligence that the Japanese force was expected, but the PT boats' efforts were unsuccessful. None of the 24 torpedoes they launched struck their targets. At approximately 2 a.m., during a moonless night, Kennedy observed a Japanese destroyer returning from Kolombangara. As he attempted to maneuver for an attack, PT-109 was struck and cut in half by the destroyer Amagiri. 2 crew members were killed in the collision. The survivors avoided capture by swimming to a small island, later known as Plum Pudding Island, located several miles from the site of the sinking. Kennedy, despite aggravating a pre-existing back injury, assisted a seriously burned crew member, Patrick McMahon, by towing him with a life jacket strap held between his teeth. From the island, Kennedy and Ensign George Ross made multiple trips to nearby islands looking for assistance. Eventually, they encountered local islanders familiar with English. Kennedy carved the crew's location onto a coconut shell, which was taken by canoe to the nearest Allied post. 7 days after the loss of PT-109, the crew was rescued. The incident received substantial public attention. In 1944, journalist John Hersey wrote an account for The New Yorker, which presented Kennedy as a calm and capable officer. The story later supported Kennedy's public image during his political career and became the subject of a film. For his actions during the event, Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, and his injuries qualified him for the Purple Heart. After recovering for a month, Kennedy returned to duty and took command of PT-59. On November 2, 1943, PT-59 assisted in the evacuation of a group of Marines near the Warrior River on Choiseul Island. Kennedy's boat provided cover from shore fire and transported several Marines to safety. His health continued to worsen, and he was relieved of command on November 18th. He was hospitalized on Tulagi and later returned to the United States, arriving in San Francisco in early January 1944. Kennedy spent much of the remainder of 1944 receiving treatment for his back injury at Chelsea Naval Hospital in Massachusetts. In early 1945, he continued his recovery at Castle Hot Springs in Arizona, which was serving temporarily as a military hospital. On March 1, 1945, he was retired from the Naval Reserve on physical disability and was honorably discharged with the rank of lieutenant. When asked later how he became a war hero, he responded with a characteristic remark that his PT boat had been cut in half. On August 12, 1944, Kennedy's older brother, Joseph Jr., was killed during a Navy air mission. His remains were not recovered. Kennedy believed that his brother's decision to undertake the dangerous mission reflected a desire to exceed his own wartime accomplishments. In the months that followed, Kennedy worked on a privately published memorial volume titled As We Remember Joe, which collected recollections about his brother. In April 1945, Kennedy's father arranged for him to work as a special correspondent for the Hearst newspaper chain, a position made possible through his long-standing friendship with publisher William Randolph Hearst. The role kept Kennedy's name in public circulation and provided him with early exposure to journalism as a potential career path. During this period, Kennedy reported on several major post-war events, including the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco, the British general election, and the Potsdam Conference in Germany. After the death of Joseph Kennedy Jr., who had been expected to lead the family's political ambitions, John Kennedy assumed that role as the next eldest son. In early 1946, Boston Mayor Morris J. Tobin considered Kennedy as a possible running mate for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. However, Joseph Kennedy Sr. preferred that his son seek a congressional seat, believing that time in Washington would provide greater visibility and better prepare him for future national office. In 1946, Representative James Michael Curley left his seat in Massachusetts's 11th congressional district to return to the Boston mayoralty. The district was solidly Democratic, and Kennedy established legal residency near the Massachusetts State House. In the Democratic primary, he received 42% of the vote, defeating 9 other candidates. His father played an active role throughout the campaign, maintaining regular contact with reporters and editors and encouraging favorable coverage that emphasized Kennedy's war service. The campaign made extensive use of advertising, including posters, subway space, and mailings of John Hersey's article on the PT-109 incident. Although Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives in the 1946 elections, Kennedy won the general election with 73% of the vote. During his time in Congress, Kennedy was known for a high rate of absenteeism, much of which was attributed to ongoing health issues. Colleagues noted that he appeared more interested in writing than in legislative administration, and that he was reserved and shy. He showed little attachment to the traditional procedures of the House and expressed frustration with its slow pace. Kennedy served 6 years in the House, where he joined the Education and Labor Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee. His primary interests centered on foreign policy. He supported the Truman Doctrine and the broader effort to contain Soviet influence at the outset of the Cold War. He backed public housing legislation and opposed the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, which limited union activity. While not as outspoken as Senator Joseph McCarthy, he supported the Internal Security Act of 1950, which required the registration of communists with the government. He also expressed concern over the expansion of communist influence in China, criticizing the Truman administration for its handling of the situation during a speech in 1949. Kennedy maintained a long-standing connection with the Boy Scouts, participating in the Boston Council from 1946 to 1955 in several leadership roles, including district vice chairman and executive board member. Seeking to strengthen his relationship with Italian-American voters, Kennedy supported a substantial aid package to Italy in November 1947. He argued that Italy was vulnerable to communist political movements and represented an important early front in post-war European realignment. More broadly, Kennedy believed that the United States should develop non-military methods of encouraging stability in countries vulnerable to communist influence, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. He viewed this approach as a way to avoid perceptions of American imperialism while still offering an attractive alternative to Soviet influence. Throughout his House tenure, Kennedy frequently returned to Massachusetts on weekends to address civic, veterans, and fraternal groups. He also kept detailed index cards on individuals who might assist in future state-level campaigns. When considering his next political step, Kennedy dismissed the idea of running for governor of Massachusetts, remarking that the role involved primarily administrative responsibilities that did not align with his interests. By 1949, Kennedy had begun preparing for a 1952 Senate campaign against three-term Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. The campaign adopted the slogan, "Kennedy will do more for Massachusetts." Joseph Kennedy Sr. again provided significant financial support. He persuaded the Boston Post to endorse John by arranging a substantial loan for the publisher. Kennedy's younger brother Robert assumed the role of campaign manager, while Kennedy's mother and sisters held a series of informal teas across the state to introduce him to women voters. In the 1952 presidential election, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower carried Massachusetts by a wide margin, but Kennedy defeated Lodge by approximately 70,000 votes. The following year, in 1953, Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier. Kennedy underwent several spinal surgeries over the next 2 years, during which he spent extended periods in hospitals. At times, his condition was severe enough for him to receive Catholic last rites. While recovering in 1956, Kennedy published Profiles in Courage, a book highlighting U.S. senators who had taken unpopular stands based on principle. The work received the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957. Years later, Kennedy's close advisor Ted Sorensen confirmed that he had contributed significantly to the writing. At the start of his Senate term, Kennedy emphasized economic concerns in Massachusetts. Although his voting record largely resembled that of Lodge, he had opposed the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which Lodge had supported. Kennedy criticized Lodge for not doing enough to prevent manufacturing jobs from leaving Massachusetts for southern states with lower labor costs. In 1953, Kennedy introduced a 36-point program to support New England industries such as fishing, textile production, watchmaking, and shipbuilding. He also encouraged development of nuclear and hydroelectric power in the region. Congress ultimately adopted many aspects of his proposals. Concerned about preserving the natural environment of Cape Cod, Kennedy co-sponsored the Cape Cod National Seashore Bill in 1959. Kennedy developed a reputation for being attentive to constituent requests and for supporting federal assistance when local communities faced natural disasters, such as the tornado that struck Worcester in 1953. That same year, he supported the St. Lawrence Seaway despite concerns that it might disadvantage the Port of Boston. In 1954, when the Senate voted to censure Senator Joseph McCarthy, Kennedy was the only Democrat who did not cast a vote. He had prepared a statement supporting censure, but he was hospitalized for back surgery at the time. The incident later affected his standing among liberal voters. By 1956, Kennedy had gained influence within the Massachusetts Democratic Party and helped deliver the state delegation to Adlai Stevenson II at the Democratic National Convention. Stevenson allowed the convention to choose the vice presidential nominee. Kennedy finished second in the balloting, which gave him considerable national exposure. From 1957 onward, Kennedy served on the Senate's Select Committee on Labor Rackets, with his brother Robert as chief counsel. The hearings, which examined corruption in labor unions, attracted significant public attention. Kennedy later introduced legislation addressing improper use of union funds, financial transparency, and audits. The bill passed the Senate, but did not pass the House. That year, Kennedy also joined the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He supported Algerian independence from France and proposed amendments to provide assistance to Eastern European countries under Soviet influence. In 1959, he introduced a bill to remove loyalty oath requirements from the National Defense Education Act. Kennedy's voting record on civil rights was mixed. He cast a procedural vote that some viewed as weakening the Civil Rights Act of 1957, though he ultimately supported the compromise version that passed. His position reflected, in part, the political realities of a state with a small black population, and his brother Robert later acknowledged that their focus at the time was primarily on Massachusetts rather than national civil rights issues. In 1958, Kennedy was re-elected to the Senate with 73.6% of the vote, the largest margin in the history of Massachusetts elections. After securing re-election, he began traveling across the United States to build support for a presidential campaign in 1960. Although many historians describe Kennedy's Senate years as relatively quiet, he drafted more than 300 bills related to Massachusetts and New England, several of which became law. Observers at the time offered differing views of his performance. Senator Lyndon Johnson, the majority leader, considered Kennedy intelligent but not particularly engaged in the daily work of legislating. Kennedy himself later remarked that the Senate could be corrupting, citing its tendency to focus on political bargaining. His financial independence allowed him to avoid some of the pressures that shaped other senators' decisions, though he remained attentive to the concerns of his home state. On January 2, 1960, Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president. Although some questioned his relative youth and limited national experience, his public speaking skills and personal appeal helped him gain a substantial following. His principal competitors included Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, former presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson II, and Senator Hubert Humphrey. Kennedy traveled widely during the primary season to build support. His strategy focused on winning key primaries to demonstrate his viability to party leaders, many of whom controlled delegate selection. He also aimed to show that a Catholic candidate could win broad popular backing. His victories over Senator Humphrey in the Wisconsin and West Virginia primaries strengthened his standing as the convention approached. When Kennedy arrived at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, he held more delegates than any other candidate, though not enough to secure the nomination outright. Stevenson still enjoyed strong support, and Johnson hoped that party leaders would turn to him on a later ballot. Former President Harry Truman expressed reservations about Kennedy's level of experience. Kennedy's campaign organization worked to gather additional support, and he won the nomination on the first ballot. Kennedy selected Lyndon Johnson as his running mate, despite objections from his brother Robert. and some liberal supporters who preferred labor leader Walter Reuther. Kennedy believed that Johnson's presence on the ticket would help secure support in the South. In his acceptance speech, Kennedy introduced the concept of a new frontier, describing it as a set of challenges rather than promises. At the beginning of the general election campaign, Vice President Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee, held a lead in public opinion polls. Major campaign issues included the state of the economy, U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, the situation in Cuba, and concerns about whether Kennedy's Catholic faith would influence his decisions in office. To address the latter, Kennedy delivered a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in which he emphasized his commitment to the separation of church and state. Both campaigns agreed to participate in the first televised presidential debates in U.S. history. Approximately 70 million Americans watched the first debate. Kennedy had reviewed the studio setup in advance and appeared confident on camera. Nixon, recovering from an injury and unfamiliar with the studio conditions, appeared less composed. Although interpretations of audience reactions vary, many observers believed that the debates improved Kennedy's standing among voters. The debates marked a turning point in American politics by underscoring the influence of television on electoral campaigns. Kennedy gained momentum following the debates and entered Election Day with a slight advantage. The final result was one of the closest presidential elections of the century. Kennedy won the popular vote by a narrow margin, about 0.2%, and received 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. Some electors from Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma cast protest votes for Senator Harry F. Byrd, rather than for Kennedy. At age 43, Kennedy became the youngest person elected president of the United States, though Theodore Roosevelt had been younger when he assumed the office after President McKinley's assassination. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States at noon on January 20, 1961. In his inaugural address, he encouraged Americans to participate actively in public life and stated, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." He also urged nations around the world to cooperate in addressing what he described as the major challenges facing humanity, including tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. He emphasized that the work ahead would take far longer than a single administration, and concluded by asking both Americans and people in other nations to uphold high standards of responsibility and sacrifice. The inaugural address conveyed Kennedy's belief that his administration could play a significant role in shaping future domestic and international developments. Managing the difference between this broad vision and the practical demands of daily governance became a central feature of his early presidency. Kennedy reorganized the executive decision-making structure used by the previous administration. Instead of a more hierarchical system, he preferred an arrangement in which information and advice flowed directly to him through multiple channels. While the cabinet continued to play an important role, Kennedy depended heavily on advisors within the executive office. Despite concerns about the appearance of nepotism, Kennedy appointed his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, a position in which he served as a close advisor and was frequently involved in major policy discussions. Kennedy's foreign policy was shaped largely by ongoing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Like previous administrations, he supported the policy of containment, which aimed to prevent the spread of communism. Concerned about the risks of nuclear conflict, Kennedy adopted a defense strategy known as flexible response. This approach emphasized a range of military options rather than reliance on massive nuclear retaliation and encouraged a system of mutual deterrence. Kennedy placed considerable attention on strengthening U.S. military capabilities. Between 1961 and 1964, the number of American nuclear weapons increased by approximately 50%, as did the number of B-52 bombers assigned to deliver them. This represented a significant expansion of U.S. military capacity compared to the previous administration. In January 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced his support for wars of national liberation, a term that indicated potential encouragement of revolutionary movements in various regions. Kennedy viewed this statement as a challenge to the United States and its allies, and as a sign of continued geopolitical competition. Between 1960 and 1963, 24 countries gained independence as global decolonization continued. Kennedy sought to improve relations with these emerging nations by expanding economic aid and appointing ambassadors with regional expertise. His administration created programs such as Food for Peace and the Peace Corps to support developing countries. Food for Peace became a significant component of U.S. foreign policy, providing agricultural assistance that helped many nations stabilize their economies and, over time, become commercial buyers of American products. During his presidential campaign, Kennedy criticized the Eisenhower administration for losing influence in Africa. He emphasized that the United States should support anti-colonial movements and uphold the principle of self-determination. Kennedy viewed the Congo crisis as one of the central foreign policy challenges of his presidency. He backed a United Nations effort to prevent the secession of the mineral-rich Katanga region. Katanga's leader, Moise Tshombe, declared the region independent, prompting the Soviet Union to supply assistance to the central Congolese government. On October 2, 1962, Kennedy signed legislation authorizing U.S. support for a United Nations bond issue, ensuring continued funding for UN peacekeeping operations in the Congo and other regions. One of Kennedy's earliest actions as president was the establishment of the Peace Corps. On March 1, 1961, he signed Executive Order 924, formally creating the organization, and appointed his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, as its first director. The Peace Corps sent American volunteers to assist developing countries in areas such as education, agriculture, public health, and construction. Kennedy believed that the presence of volunteers could strengthen relations with these countries and reduce the likelihood of communist influence. Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Ghana were the first participants. By March 1963, the program had grown to 5,000 members, and by the following year, 10,000. Since 1961, more than 200,000 Americans have served in the Peace Corps across 139 countries. Kennedy anticipated an early summit meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, but initial diplomatic exchanges were complicated. In early 1961, Kennedy responded strongly to a routine speech by Khrushchev on Cold War issues. Although the speech was primarily intended for domestic audiences within the Soviet Union, Kennedy interpreted it as a personal challenge. This misinterpretation increased tensions prior to the Vienna summit. The summit agenda included several issues, but both leaders recognized that Berlin would be the most difficult topic. At the time, the city was divided into East and West Berlin, with West Berlin supported by the United States and its allies, while East Berlin was aligned with the Soviet Union. A significant number of East Germans had left for West Berlin, and the Soviet government wanted to end this movement by bringing all of Berlin under the control of East Germany. Kennedy met with Khrushchev in Vienna on June 4, 1961. Kennedy left the meeting dissatisfied with his performance, feeling that he had allowed Khrushchev to dominate the discussions. Khrushchev noted Kennedy's intelligence, but regarded him as inexperienced. During the meeting, Kennedy stated clearly that any treaty limiting U.S. access to West Berlin would be considered an act of war. Shortly after the summit, the Soviet Union announced its intention to sign such a treaty with East Berlin. Kennedy believed that the circumstances required the United States to prepare for the possibility of a nuclear conflict. Following the summit, more than 20,000 East Germans crossed into West Berlin, contributing to heightened Cold War tensions. Kennedy convened a series of meetings, during which former Secretary of State Dean Acheson recommended a military buildup in cooperation with NATO allies. In July 1961, Kennedy delivered a televised speech announcing an increase of $3.25 billion to the defense budget and the addition of over 200,000 military personnel. He stated that an attack on West Berlin would be regarded as an attack on the United States. Public approval of the speech was high. In August, the Soviet Union and East German authorities blocked the flow of East Germans into West Berlin by erecting barbed wire barriers, which were soon replaced with the Berlin Wall. Although Kennedy opposed the situation, he accepted the wall as a means of preventing further escalation. He sent Vice President Lyndon Johnson to West Berlin to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to its defense. In the months that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union resumed nuclear testing, ending a previous moratorium. A brief confrontation between American and Soviet tanks occurred at Checkpoint Charlie in October 1961, but it was resolved through a back channel established with Soviet contact Georgy Bolshakov. Reflecting on the situation, Kennedy noted that the wall was undesirable, but preferable to the outbreak of war. The Eisenhower administration had developed a plan to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba through an invasion carried out by Cuban exiles trained by the United States. The operation was organized by the Central Intelligence Agency and relied on a paramilitary force composed of anti-Castro exiles. During the 1960 presidential campaign, Kennedy expressed strong opposition to Castro's government. After taking office, Kennedy reviewed the plan created under his predecessor and chose to proceed with it, despite the risk that it might heighten tensions with the Soviet Union. He approved the final version of the plan on April 4, 1961. On April 15, 1961, 8 B-26 bombers supplied by the CIA flew from Nicaragua to attack Cuban airfields. The airstrikes were not fully effective, and much of the Cuban Air Force remained operational. 2 days later, on April 17th, approximately 1,500 Cuban exiles, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs. They encountered significant resistance almost immediately. The operation had been designed to trigger a widespread uprising against Castro, but no such uprising took place. The United States did not provide air support during the invasion. Within 2 days, Cuban forces defeated the invaders. A total of 114 members of Brigade 2506 were killed, and Kennedy entered negotiations for the return of the remaining 1,189 prisoners. After nearly 20 months, Cuba agreed to release them in exchange for $53 million in food and medical supplies. The outcome of the operation led Castro to assume that a second invasion might occur, further straining relations between Cuba and the United States. According to biographer Richard Reeves, Kennedy had focused more on the potential political impact of the operation than on the military risks. After the failure, Kennedy believed that the plan may have been structured in a way that placed him in a difficult position. He publicly accepted responsibility, stating that the administration had made mistakes but could learn from them. Kennedy's approval ratings increased following the incident, aided in part by public statements of support from Richard Nixon and former President Dwight Eisenhower. Kennedy appointed Robert Kennedy to help lead a review of the causes of the failure. In the months that followed, the administration banned all Cuban imports and persuaded the Organization of American States to expel Cuba from the organization. In late 1961, the Kennedy administration created a small interagency group known as the Special Group, augmented, chaired by Robert Kennedy, and including General Edward Lansdale, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and others. Its purpose was to manage covert efforts against Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. In November 1961, Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a wide-ranging campaign of intelligence gathering, sabotage, and subversion aimed at undermining Castro's regime. Some proposals, such as Operation Northwoods, which recommended staging attacks on U.S. targets and blaming them on Cuba, were rejected by Kennedy in March 1962. Nonetheless, planning for a possible invasion of Cuba continued into the summer of 1962. After the failed Bay of Pigs operation, the Soviet Union expanded both economic and military assistance to Cuba. Soviet plans included the deployment of medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, bomber aircraft, and tactical nuclear weapons on the island. U.S. reconnaissance flights in October 1962 documented the construction of missile sites in Cuba. Kennedy's advisors concluded that these missiles posed an immediate threat to the United States. Kennedy faced a series of unattractive options. A direct attack on the missile sites risked triggering a wider war with the Soviet Union, while inaction would allow nuclear weapons to remain close to the U.S. mainland and might weaken American credibility. To manage the crisis, Kennedy convened a group of senior officials and advisors, later known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, which met in secret for nearly 2 weeks. Some advisors favored a surprise airstrike on the missile facilities, but others argued that such an act would resemble the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After deliberation, Kennedy accepted a proposal to impose a naval quarantine on Cuba, stopping ships suspected of carrying offensive weapons. On October 22, 1962, he announced the discovery of the missiles and the decision to intercept further Soviet deliveries. The Organization of American States endorsed the U.S. position. Over the following days, several Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, then stopped or turned back. During this period, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 reconnaissance plane over Cuba, killing the pilot. Kennedy chose not to retaliate militarily, hoping to avoid escalation. Behind the scenes, Robert Kennedy informed Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin that the United States was prepared to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a reasonable period after the crisis, provided the Soviet Union dismantled its missile sites in Cuba. On October 28th, Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles under United Nations supervision. In return, the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba and privately agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey, which were already being superseded by submarine-based systems. The resolution of the crisis led to the establishment of a direct communication link known as the Hotline between Washington and Moscow. Many observers later viewed the Cuban Missile Crisis as the closest the world came to nuclear war, and noted that both Kennedy and Khrushchev ultimately chose compromise over confrontation. Kennedy's handling of the crisis improved his domestic standing, and his public approval ratings rose. In Latin America, Kennedy sought to counter communist influence with economic aid and social reform rather than military intervention alone. He launched the Alliance for Progress in 1961, calling for economic development, social reforms, and increased respect for human rights in the region. Congress approved an initial $500 million appropriation. The program supported projects in housing, education, health, and infrastructure. However, many of its goals were only partially realized. Land reform was limited, population growth outpaced gains in living standards, and its direct impact on poverty was modest. By the early 1970s, U.S. support had declined, and the regional body established to manage the program was dissolved. The Kennedy administration inherited CIA efforts aimed at removing certain authoritarian leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean, including Castro in Cuba and Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Kennedy insisted that any such operations preserve plausible deniability for the United States. After Trujillo was assassinated in June 1961, the U.S. response was cautious but generally welcomed the possibility of political change. In Southeast Asia, Kennedy's attention was initially drawn to Laos, where a civil war raised concerns about communist expansion. Eisenhower had emphasized Laos as a strategic point in the region. Kennedy shifted the public U.S. position from supporting a free Laos to a neutral Laos, while privately recognizing Vietnam as a likely focal point for containment efforts. He declined to deploy large numbers of American ground troops to Laos, but approved covert CIA operations, including support for the Hmong people and aerial bombing against communist forces. In Vietnam, Kennedy continued and expanded U.S. support for the government of South Vietnam. Building on policies from the Eisenhower administration, he increased the number of American military advisors, financed the South Vietnamese Army, and authorized the use of U.S. helicopter units and programs such as Operation Ranch Hand, which used herbicides like Agent Orange to reduce jungle cover and disrupt guerrilla operations. Vietnam, however, remained a secondary issue in Washington until 1963. Kennedy gradually became disillusioned with South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, particularly after Diem's repression of Buddhist protests in 1963. Reports from the new U.S. ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., indicated that South Vietnamese military leaders were considering removing Diem. After internal debate, the Kennedy administration signaled that U.S. support for Diem was conditional and that a change in leadership would not be opposed, provided assassination was not part of the plan. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese officers staged a coup. Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were killed the next day. By late 1963, U.S. military personnel in South Vietnam numbered about 16,000, up from roughly 900 at the end of the Eisenhower administration. More than 100 Americans had been killed in the conflict, and the long-term U.S. policy remained unsettled. In October 1963, Kennedy approved National Security Action Memorandum 263, which called for the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of the year, reflecting a belief that South Vietnamese forces were increasingly capable. At the same time, the memorandum reaffirmed U.S. support for South Vietnam's fight against communism. Historians have since debated whether Kennedy would have significantly escalated or reduced U.S. involvement had he lived. In Europe, Kennedy worked to reaffirm alliances and counterbalance Soviet influence. In June 1963, he traveled to West Germany and visited West Berlin. On June 26, he delivered a speech at the City Hall, expressing solidarity with the people of West Berlin and criticizing the division symbolized by the Berlin Wall. He noted that democratic governments did not need to build walls to prevent their citizens from leaving. The speech, remembered for the phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," received an enthusiastic response. In the Middle East, Kennedy moved away from the arms embargo on Israel maintained by earlier administrations. He strengthened security ties, viewing support for Israel as both a strategic and moral commitment, and sold Israel advanced defensive systems, including Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. Motivations for this shift have been variously attributed to domestic political considerations and genuine sympathy for Israel. Kennedy also monitored developments in Iraq. After the Qasim government sharply reduced the concession area of the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1961, U.S. and British officials pressed for a stronger American response. In 1962, the State Department adopted new guidelines to expand U.S. influence. Kennedy instructed the CIA to explore options for a change in government. In February 1963, the Ba'ath Party overthrew Qasim in a violent coup. Although rumors circulated that the CIA had orchestrated the coup, later evidence suggested no direct U.S. role. The administration welcomed the outcome and later approved an arms sale to the new government. Kennedy maintained personal ties to Ireland, reflecting his family heritage. In June 1963, he made a state visit to Ireland, where he addressed the Irish Parliament, received several honorary degrees, and was granted the freedom of multiple cities. He visited the ancestral Kennedy home near New Ross in County Wexford. Kennedy later described the trip as one of the most enjoyable experiences of his life. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered a notable address at American University in Washington, D.C., sometimes called the Strategy of Peace speech. He called for a re-examination of attitudes toward the Soviet Union and emphasized the importance of reducing the risk of nuclear war. He announced that the Soviets had indicated an interest in a test ban and that the United States was postponing planned nuclear tests in the atmosphere. Concerned about radioactive fallout and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, Kennedy and Khrushchev moved toward a limited nuclear test ban. Initial efforts at a comprehensive ban faltered over disagreements on inspection procedures. Ultimately, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union negotiated a partial test ban treaty that prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, but allowed underground testing. The U.S. Senate approved the treaty in September 1963, and Kennedy signed it the following month. Domestically, Kennedy's legislative program was known as the New Frontier. His narrow election victory, limited influence in Congress, and the demands of foreign policy constrained his success. He sought federal aid for education, health insurance for the elderly, housing legislation, assistance for depressed regions, and a higher minimum wage. He achieved passage of an increase in the minimum wage, the Area Redevelopment Act, and the Housing Act of 1961, which provided support for urban renewal and public housing. Proposals for large-scale federal aid to education, health insurance for the elderly, and a new Department of Urban Affairs failed in Congress. Kennedy also supported manpower training programs, resulting in the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962, which aimed to retrain workers whose jobs were affected by technological change. Inspired in part by his sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver, he backed initiatives in mental health and intellectual disabilities, including the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. In trade policy, Kennedy secured passage of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, giving the president authority to negotiate substantial tariff reductions with the European Economic Community. This set the stage for the Kennedy round of international trade negotiations later in the decade. On economic policy, Kennedy accepted the advice of Council of Economic Advisers Chairman Walter Heller, who argued in favor of a large, Keynesian-style tax cut to stimulate growth. Kennedy proposed reducing both individual and corporate tax rates, believing that stronger growth would ultimately raise federal revenues. Debate over the proposal continued in Congress during his lifetime. It was enacted after his death as the Revenue Act of 1964. Kennedy also supported a more expansionary fiscal and monetary stance to address unemployment and stimulate growth. During his presidency, economic performance improved. Gross domestic product rose at a faster rate than in the preceding years. Inflation remained low, and unemployment eased. Industrial production and consumer demand both increased. In dealings with industry, Kennedy sometimes took a firm position. In 1962, he objected strongly when U.S. Steel announced a price increase after informal understandings about wage and price restraint. The Justice Department opened an investigation, and other companies declined to follow U.S. Steel's lead. Eventually, U.S. Steel rescinded the price increase. On civil rights, Kennedy initially proceeded cautiously. He relied on Southern Democrats in Congress to advance his legislative program and did not propose major civil rights legislation early in his term. He did, however, appoint black officials to important positions, including Thurgood Marshall to the federal judiciary, and issued executive orders promoting equal employment opportunity and banning discrimination in federally funded housing. Events in the South, such as the Freedom Rides, the integration of the University of Mississippi by James Meredith, and ongoing protests, gradually pushed civil rights higher on the administration's agenda. Kennedy used federal marshals and, in some instances, troops to enforce court orders. By mid-1963, he concluded that comprehensive civil rights legislation was necessary. In a nationally televised address on June 11, 1963, he called for legislation guaranteeing equal access to public accommodations and stronger protection of voting rights. His proposals became the foundation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was enacted after his death. Kennedy's relationship with civil rights leaders was complex. He worried that large demonstrations, such as the March on Washington in August 1963, might provoke a backlash in Congress, but he ultimately cooperated with organizers to ensure that the event remained peaceful. He invited the march's leaders to the White House afterwards and recognized the significance of the day, even as he remained concerned about the legislative prospects of his bill. Kennedy also addressed issues related to women's rights. He created the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in 1961, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. The Commission's 1963 report documented wide-ranging legal and social inequalities. That same year, Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, aiming to reduce wage disparities between men and women. Under the direction of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the administration placed greater emphasis on combating organized crime, supporting legislation to address interstate racketeering and illegal gambling. Kennedy also signed a bill ending the mandatory death penalty for first-degree murder in the District of Columbia. In agricultural policy, Kennedy tried to reduce surplus production, support farm incomes, and limit federal spending, but many of his proposals met resistance in Congress. He did expand food assistance efforts, including a pilot food stamp program and an enlarged school lunch program to increase demand for domestic farm products and assist low-income families. Kennedy's record on Native American issues included allowing the construction of the Kinzua Dam in Pennsylvania to proceed, despite its impact on land belonging to the Seneca Nation under an 18th century treaty. He expressed concern about the displacement of the Seneca people and directed federal agencies to provide assistance, but did not halt the project. In space policy, Kennedy initially considered scaling back the crewed space program, but Vice President Johnson and NASA officials argued strongly for continued investment. Following Soviet advances, including Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight, Kennedy concluded that a clear, ambitious goal was needed. In May 1961, he proposed that the United States commit to landing a person on the moon and returning them safely to Earth before the end of the decade. Congress largely supported the initiative and significantly increased NASA's budget. Under NASA Administrator James Webb, the agency expanded and established major new facilities, including a launch center in Florida and a manned spaceflight center in Houston. Although the Apollo program was expensive and public opinion was mixed, Kennedy viewed it as important for national prestige and technological leadership. He reiterated his support in a 1962 speech at Rice University, emphasizing that the United States chose to undertake difficult tasks to demonstrate its capabilities. The goal he set was achieved in July 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, several years after his death. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated while visiting Dallas, Texas. He had traveled to the state on a political trip intended to ease tensions within the Democratic Party between its liberal and conservative factions. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, as his motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza, Kennedy was struck by 2 bullets, one entering his upper back and exiting through his throat, and another striking his head. Kennedy was immediately taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors attempted to revive him. He was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He was 46 years old. Shortly after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder of a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit, and later with the assassination of President Kennedy. Oswald denied all charges and stated that he was a patsy. 2 days later, on November 24th, Oswald was shot and killed in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Ruby was convicted of Oswald's murder, but his conviction was later overturned on appeal. He died of cancer in 1967 before a new trial could take place. President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Warren Commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, to investigate the assassination. In its report, the commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy. Over time, these findings were questioned by many members of the public and by various researchers. A later investigation by the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 suggested that Kennedy was likely killed as part of a conspiracy, though it did not identify additional participants. Subsequent technical reviews, including acoustic analyses and Justice Department assessments, found insufficient evidence to support the existence of a second gunman or a broader plot, and reaffirmed the lack of persuasive proof of conspiracy. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington, D.C. on the evening of November 22nd. The next day, November 23rd, his flag-draped casket was placed in the East Room of the White House, where he lay in repose for 24 hours. On November 24th, the casket was moved by horse-drawn caisson to the U.S. Capitol, where Kennedy lay in state beneath the rotunda. Large crowds gathered to pay their respects. Hundreds of thousands filed past the casket during the period of viewing. The funeral took place on November 25th at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C. The Requiem Mass was celebrated by Cardinal Richard Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston, and a longtime friend of the Kennedy family. Approximately 200 guests attended, including dignitaries and representatives from more than 90 countries. After the service, a funeral procession accompanied Kennedy's casket to Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, where he was buried on a hillside overlooking the Capitol. And so, the story of John Fitzgerald Kennedy comes to a quiet close. A life that moved quickly through history, now settling for a moment into stillness. As you let the details drift away, notice how the timeline softens, dates and places becoming distant lights, names and events fading like footsteps on a quiet shore. What remains is simply the shape of a life, its rise, its challenges, its unfinished chapters, carried gently into memory. Let your thoughts loosen now. There is nothing else to follow, nowhere else to go. The past has been told, and the night can take the rest. Allow your breath to slow. Allow the room to settle around you. And allow your mind to drift into its own peaceful frontier. Thank you for spending this gentle time here. Rest well, and good night.